Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. Today I'll be analyzing the third movement of Mozart's Quintet in G minor, which is a Type 1 sonata. If you're a fan of the channel, you may remember that in my discussion with Anthony Barrese, we discussed a Type 1 sonata, the Overture to the Barber of Seville. Overtures are most often Type 1 sonatas, but I thought this movement of the quintet would be a good way to present them as I typically do with the score and recording. A Type 1 sonata is the most simplistic form of sonata type, and is really a sonata form without a developmental rotation. One occasionally finds a slight modulatory link or retransition between the two movements, and often they have no repeat at all, making the Type 1 a popular option for slow movements. It's notable that although various theorists have claimed that the Type 1 sonata, or Exposition recap sonata, is a kind of primordial sonata, Hepokoski and Darcy point out that Type 1 and Type 3, or textbook sonata type, appear around the 1720s and 30s essentially simultaneously. There is no historical reason to think of the Type 1 sonata as a precursor to the larger form. Let's take a look at the quintet movement. In the context of this piece, the first movement was in G minor, and the second movement's minuet was in G minor with a G major trio. Placing the minuet second rather than third, especially in a minor mode work, emphasizes the inescapability of the tonic mode. In fact, in the minuet, we discussed my view that the minuet is a sort of modal reality, while the trio was a representation of what could have been, an if-only situation. Reinforcing that view is the key of the third movement, the submediant 6, E-flat major. In their chapter on sonata cycles, Hepokoski and Darcy discuss a major mode submediant movement, especially in third place, as being a, quote, comfortable, cool shadow or short-lived respite, again describing it as a, quote, if-only, end quote, representation, or perhaps a false major, an ironic representation. Let's move through the piece and you can decide for yourself. At first, it seems that Mozart is setting up a period with a half cadence here. As the phrase continues, however, the violin is tentative. None of the other voices are moving. They're all locked into a dominant pedal. And where we should find an authentic cadence 2 bars later, which would end the phrase, instead, the music devolves into motivic exchanges between high and low voices. When the instruments regather themselves and move toward a cadential 6/4, instead of a cadence we get a 6 chord. The primary theme will not suffer the indignities of the first movement's primary theme, which failed to articulate any cadence before moving to transition, and so it tries again. Little has changed in the music between the first attempt at a cadence and the second. Indeed, rhythmically, the second attempt, though it is a perfect authentic cadence, is also flawed, occurring on the weaker beat 3 rather than beat 1. This is something that will carry through all the major cadences in this work. In my mind, this adds to this sense of unreality. The music is what might have been, not what is. The transition, made up of fragments of the primary theme, also dissolves, slowly losing voices before it reaches a kind of half-cadence medial caesura in the dominant key of B-flat. With barely any room for a breath, a secondary theme rushes in to fill the gap. This initial S theme is reality jutting into the sonata in the form of the unusual key of B-flat minor. Fortunately for the trajectory of the sonata, this theme is also unable to cadence and reaches the same 5-6 deceptive cadence as the primary theme. I've labeled this exposition as I would a trimodular block, which is an exposition with an S theme, usually a second transition and medial caesura, and a second S theme which cadences. But in this movement, this is somewhat debatable. I hear this section here as a caesura, even if there really isn't any silence. But maybe you don't hear it that way, in which case this would more accurately be labeled S1.2. Either way, luckily Mozart has given us an S in the major mode. In fact, perhaps to overcompensate, this S is very active and has a soaring melody in the first violin. This secondary theme cadences not once, but twice, making it somewhat overdetermined. Interestingly, Mozart initially cadences on a downbeat, but this cadence's candidacy for structural cadence is erased by continuing with the secondary theme. After dropping the 16th notes, the upper four voices propose a cadential strategy to the cello, who seems to be the least agreeable of this group. Finally, it does agree to join, and the essential expositional cadence is again on the weaker beat 3, before a closing zone and a tiny 3/8 note chromatic line takes us back into the recapitulation. Before we go into the second recapitulatory rotation, I want to point out that I think it's possible to hear this final cadence section as a continuation of the initial phrase. Finally achieving cadence at the end of the exposition. Also remember that considering the length of the first movement, its development was unusually short, around 10% of the total work, and this movement has no development at all. Will this trend continue into the fourth movement? The recapitulation has strong correspondence with the first movement, but it differs in some interesting ways. The primary theme is almost exactly the same, but the transition opens with an unusual minor 5 chord, perhaps a flashback to B-flat minor in the Exposition. The initial secondary theme, again in minor, is essentially the same until we reach the second transition. Mozart, perhaps highlighting the struggle of continuing in this light and breezy major mode, tosses in some very chromatic chords: B major, F sharp minor, and an F sharp diminished seventh, chilling us with a reminder of the tonic of the entire work, G major, before finally opening the secondary theme. As in the Exposition, this movement reaches structural cadence on beat 3, and a brief, discursive coda loosely based on the primary theme follows. Hepokoski and Darcy, in their chapter on Type 1 sonatas, discuss how a P-based coda on the end of a Type 1 sonata can bring up correspondence with Type 4 sonatas, or the sonata rondo. As we move into the final movement of this piece, the Type 1, Type 4 sonata hybrid may return, but in the case of the third movement, the coda is really only fragments of the primary theme, rather than a full restatement, or even a statement of the beginning of the theme. I think we can conclude that that is not what's happening. That was the third movement of Mozart's Quintet in G minor. I think probably the first and third are the most famous, but in a strange way, the fourth is probably the most discussed. I should have that out for you in less than a week. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to support the channel, consider joining my Patreon, which is linked in the description, where you can also access copies of many of the materials that I discuss in these videos. If you have questions or comments, please leave them below or feel free to email me.